Everybody, and thank you for joining me as I discuss the topic of my research paper for English 112, The Fallacy of Race, Division, and Control. The United States of America, it's no secret, has a race problem. Racial problems have plagued this country really since its inception. Racial tensions are at the forefront of the news cycle right now. I mean, you take a look right now at the shooting of unarmed African Americans in Minnesota and Louisiana, the retaliatory shootings toward police officers in Baton Rouge and Dallas. I mean, those incidents have led many people to say that the racial divide in this country has never been wider than it is right now at this very moment. And race affects so many parts of our lives in the United States. I mean, you take a look at aspects of, just getting jobs, buying or renting homes, purchasing health care, and even how many of us vote are all affected and determined by racial boundaries. It's really a sad commentary that race is so important to so many people in this society, especially when one takes the time to realize that race, in actuality, as we know it, is a fallacy. That's right. Race doesn't really exist the way that we conceptualize it, the way that we think that it does. Race does not exist and is used strictly, in my opinion, as a sociological device to divide and control the populations. And really, when you take a look at it, really, you get it from the grassroots section from the beginning. How race is defined. You take a look in Webster's dictionary. Race is defined as each of the major divisions of humankind having distinct physical characteristics. And many experts are telling us right now that just by its very definition that the science behind race simply doesn't exist. Now, as we all know, anybody who's ever taken a biology course, be it in middle school, high school, or college, knows that our physical characteristics are determined by our DNA. And you take a look at some of the work that's been done by some of the leading DNA experts, leading scientists in the field, including one that I cited in my paper, Dr. Alan Templeton. He's a professor of biology and arts and sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. He analyzed DNA from global populations that reveal the patterns of human evolution over the past 1 million years. And he even wrote a paper entitled Human Races, a Genetic Race, Human Races, a Genetic and Evolutionary Perspective, which was released back in October of 1998. And I use a quote from him in the paper that says, "Race is a real cultural, political, and economic concept in society, but not a biological concept, and that, unfortunately, is what many people wrongfully consider to be the essence of race in humans, genetic differences. Evolutionary history is the key to understanding race, and new molecular biology techniques have developed so much on recent evolutionary history. This very objective analysis shows the outcome is not even a very close call. There's nothing even like a really distinct subdivision of humanity. I'm not saying these results don't recognize genetic differences among human populations. There are differences, but they don't define historical lineages that have persisted for a long time. The point is, for a race to have any scientific validity and integrity, it has to have generality beyond any one species. If it doesn't, then the concepts are meaningless." And to kind of break this down into more layman terms, it's easy to get lost in kind of the verbosity of scientific lingo. You take a look at Dr. Templeton's study. You take into effect some of the groups that he looked at. It included Europeans, sub-Saharan Africans, and Melanesians. Now, Melanesians inhabit the small islands off of Australia. And to take a look physically, Melanesians and sub-Saharan Africans share more physical traits. They have the darker skin. They have more consistent hair texture than either of those races do with the European models. But as Dr. Templeton forwarded his study and took a look at the classification, the DNA behind those classifications, according to his study, it showed the inhabitants of the islands of Northeast Australia, those Melanesians, they had more in common. There was more in common between the sub-Saharan Africans and the Europeans than there were between the Africans and the Melanesians. So, and you take a look at that, and you take a look at physical characteristics and how we view them just in our physical sight. To take a look at how someone is classified today, and you look at their DNA, which is, as we said, biologically is the construct of race, where we physically inherit our determining factors to what we see as race, and there's really no true correlation there. So again, I found that quite interesting that they're saying now that the science behind race just really doesn't necessarily add up. Now, why would this even become an issue? There's some that subscribe to the standard of racial definitions, and they point to the fact that just shared physical characteristics by a member of a race, that's not necessarily all there is to it, but race also shares behaviors and beliefs. to me, that's not necessarily a racial thing as much as it is a culture thing. And there is a there is a division between race and culture. I mean, for instance, I grew up in a very racially mixed area in Harnett County, and I grew up with people of African American descent, people of Spanish descent, Caucasians, and we have a lot in common because we're from the same area. We call the same place home. We grew up with a lot of the same experiences, not all the same, but some of the same. So I don't necessarily think that when you talk about shared behaviors and beliefs, that's necessarily specific to a race. I think you're talking more about culture and where one might have come from originally. And we take a look at race, and it's been one of the most divisive issues in the history of society. I mean, you take a look at some of the great travesties and tragedies in the history of not just America but the world. I mean, certainly the Holocaust, the Spanish Inquisition, and you take a look at these things, and race was at the center of all of this. So to me, race is more of a social construct to keep people divided. If you can keep large groups of people divided,